Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are on a very focused mission. We're going to unpack an essay that, frankly, tries to radically redefine what we think of as societal success.
It really does.
Forget GDP, population growth, tech speed, all of it. Our source material argues that those metrics aren't just, inadequate, they're actually dangerous.
Inherently dangerous, yeah.
And instead, we are looking entirely at architecture, at the hidden design of relations and its ability to achieve this state called coherence.
That is the core mandate. And this isn't just some shallow critique. It's a deep philosophical argument. It insists that the usual measures of societal health growth, speed, accumulation, are basically red herrings.
Red herrings how?
They describe magnitude, sure, but they completely neglect the structural integrity of the network itself. Our goal today is absolute coverage. We want to make sure you, listening, catch every single nuance of this structural philosophy because the thesis demands that kind of precision.
So this is the shortcut to being comprehensively informed on this idea. Okay, let's unpack this. The essay kicks off by defining what it sees as the central societal danger. And that's mistaking growth for advancement, accumulation for intelligence, and speed for progress. Why is that specific confusion so destructive?
Because it completely shifts our focus.
Yeah.
It moves it from the quality of connection to just the quantity of mass. When that architecture is neglected, optimization just becomes, short-term efficiency.
Right.
You can have a system, a government, an economy, whatever, that's expanding like crazy, accumulating enormous wealth. But at the same time, it's generating this internal distortion, this fragility.
So it's accelerating forcefully.
But it's structurally guaranteed to collapse. It just lacks proportion. Magnitude without orientation only produces weight, and acceleration is neutral. It multiplies distortion just as easily as it multiplies truth.
It sounds like chasing size just makes you fragile, not resilient. So we have to immediately establish the replacement metric. If it's not speed or size, what exactly is coherence?
Coherence is the measure of meaningful complexity. That's the simplest way to put it. It's the underlying structural foundation that binds together the essential polarities any system needs to endure.
Like what? What polarities?
Things like differentiation into proportion, freedom into responsibility, and novelty into order. True advancement, according to the source, isn't about how big you get. It's about your capacity to transform profoundly without losing your essential existential identity.
That is a powerful definition. It immediately elevates coherence from just, a nice feeling of balance to an existential law.
It is.
Let's dive into part one then and explore this idea of coherence as the foundational law of advancement and reciprocity.
To do that, we first have to grasp society as this complex second-dimensional network. It's a continuous interplay of living and non-living entities, processes, systems.
And in that view, magnitude, what you call weight and pace or acceleration, they're just insufficient measures.
Precisely because they're structurally blind.
Blind how, exactly?
They have no orientation. I mean, imagine building a skyscraper faster and wider than anyone else, but you forget to tie the vertical elements to the horizontal load-bearing ones.
It's just going to collapse.
Right. Growth without orientation only produces weight that crushes the foundation. And acceleration, without that structural calibration, it just multiplies whatever signal it gets.
Yeah.
If the signal is distortion, acceleration just makes that distortion global and immediate.
So true advancement is coherence.
It's the systemic capacity to evolve while you reinforce the underlying order, to multiply freedom without dissolving responsibility.
This moves so far past the idea of decorative balance. When you call it an existential law, you're saying it's almost built into the universe's physics, but applied to society. How does the architecture reflect that law?
It joins opposites into proportion. Think about it. Stability with change, simplicity holding complexity, differentiation requiring integration. Coherence is just structural correctness.
And when this law is correctly woven into the architecture, the bylaws, protocols, infrastructures,
then efficiency and generalized intelligence are guaranteed. They become natural byproducts, not external goals you have to chase. You don't aim for intelligence, you aim for structural correctness, and intelligence just emerges from that.
That reframes the entire effort of governance, really. Now, here's where it gets really interesting for me. The relationship between the part and the whole. Section 2 insists that parts are more than mere fragments, and the whole is more than just a simple aggregation.
Right.
What structural condition is absolutely necessary for that true integration to happen?
Differentiation.
Yeah.
This is the core reciprocal tension. For the whole to integrate, the part, whether it's an individual, a subgroup, an institution, it must have the freedom to differentiate. But And this is the key. The differentiation has to be governed by the structural memory of the whole.
So there's a tension there, a reciprocity that has to be actively maintained.
It has to be. Otherwise, the system breaks down to one of two twin errors, as the essay calls them.
Let's look at those twin errors because I think they describe the pathology of incoherence perfectly.
The first error is individuation without proportion. This just dissolves into fragmentation. It's when a locality apart pursues its own motion, its own short-term survival, without any regard for the system's coherence.
Like a company polluting a river for profit.
Exactly. It's an excessive division where the parts refuse to relate properly. The second error is the opposite, integration without differentiation. This calcifies into predictability.
So top-down control.
Unity purchased at the cost of vitality. You get a rigid system where originality is suppressed just to maintain control. It's an excess of uniformity where the whole suffocates the parts. Both outcomes are fatal. They destroy the network's capacity to evolve and adapt.
Okay, so how does the architecture prevent the individual part from falling into that fragmentation trap while still giving it the power to differentiate? The essay introduces the fractal image as the key mechanism here.
The fractal image is, I think, the genius of the architecture. For individuation to serve coherence, each local scale has to carry an internal, complete representation of the whole within itself.
It's like every cell in your body carrying the full DNA blueprint of the entire organism.
That's the perfect analogy. This is the internal presence of globality.
So the local unit has this internal sight, which prevents it from having to rely on constant external rules from the top.
Precisely. The effect of carrying this internal globality is that judgment reduces bias internally. The part understands the context of its own action, and it proportions itself independently. If that fractal image is missing, the part inevitably mistakes its own short-term survival or its own preference for this system's survival.
And that leads to structural bias and distortion.
Yes. So the architectural task, then, is the active maintenance of this very difficult reciprocity. Local action must deepen global stability, and global form must preserve local capacity.
That sets up our major segment perfectly. If the fractal image is the conceptual guarantee, we now need the operational mechanisms that execute that guarantee across the entire network. So we move now to part 2. The 4 structural capacities of coherence. These are described as existential prerequisites. They're not optional refinements for any society that wants to endure. What is the power gained by correctly instantiating these 4?
The power is self-correction without necessary violence. That's the big prize. A society with these 4 capacities can scale without losing proportion, and it can integrate novelty without systemic decay.
And they generate intelligence.
They generate generalized intelligence naturally, not as some separate AI project, but as a direct consequence of correct form.
Let's dive into capacity 1, scale invariant autonomy. The core idea seems to be that autonomy must exist at every operative level, the individual, the subgroup, the institution, without collapsing into either central domination or, unchecked fragmentation.
Autonomy is the engine of vitality, but it has to be disciplined. It requires this dual movement, independence, coupled with proportion. If I'm independent but my actions aren't proportioned to the larger system, I just become toxic noise.
But if the system dominates your independence?
It loses vitality. So the structural challenge is binding that self-determination to the overall form.
The essay articulates this social mechanism as the fusion of subsidiarity and responsibility. Can you tell us how that fusion secures this disciplined autonomy?
Sure. Subsidiarity is the anti-centralization mechanism. It says decisions have to be taken at the lowest competent level where the contextual knowledge is richest. This prevents that top-heavy bureaucratic paralysis we all know.
Okay, so that's the freedom part.
That's the freedom part. But it must be balanced by responsibility. Every autonomous decision must be bound by disclosure, reciprocity, and accountability to the network. The fusion of the two ensures that local competence governs action, but systemic coherence governs relation.
So local decisions are sharp and informed.
And systemic relation is disciplined and stable.
Now we get to the most challenging part of autonomy, risk and correction. Autonomy inherently introduces risk because each node can assign meaning, and bias accumulates when that meaning is wrongly assigned, leading to unjust gain or loss. Why can't society just rely on natural compensatory mechanisms like in nature to fix this?
Because society operates through subjective valuation and collective structures. In nature, an excess of heat creates cold, supply eventually meets demand. But in society, distortions like unjust accumulation, say, a structural advantage that leads to exponential unearned power, they don't just self-correct.
They ripple outward.
They ripple outward, corrupting the law of reciprocity and accelerating decay. The intrinsic correction mechanisms are just too slow, and they're too easily overridden by organized bias.
This brings us to the most controversial requirement in the text, the extrinsic correction mechanism. It's defined as the requirement for a correct social authoritarian structure whose sole purpose is the measured removal of bias. Now, that term, authoritarian structure, it immediately raises alarms.
Of course.
How does the essay safeguard this against devolving into political tyranny?
This is a critical distinction, and it's probably the most misunderstood part. This authority does not rest in a faction. It rests purely in the design of the structure. Its legitimacy isn't political, it's almost mathematical, it's structural.
And its function?
Is purification, not punishment, not preference. Think of it less like a government agency and more like a highly principled constitutional mechanism, a bias regulator.
So it's a non-agentive structural check. It's not a person or a group making the call.
Exactly. Its job is to dissolve structural contradictions and restore equilibrium prior to any personal or political preference. It targets the bias at its root, like the unjust accumulation generated by a flawed protocol, not an individual's hard work. Its legitimacy is entirely tied to its alignment with that deeper law of reciprocity.
It's about removing the structural decay before it leads to system failure.
Right, focusing purely on correcting unjust accumulation or unwarranted deprivation.
That makes sense. It's an architectural commitment to fairness, not a political commitment to an ideology. So how do we safeguard the autonomy we just granted the individual while implementing this powerful correction mechanism?
The corrective channels act as social analogs of neuronal metaplasticity. In the brain, metaplasticity makes sure your learning thresholds are constantly recalibrated so you don't overlearn one thing and become rigid.
Okay.
In society, these mechanisms recalibrate the incentives. The examples cited are things like rituals of reflection, communal review processes, sanctions that specifically recalibrate incentives, and distributed audits. These mechanisms ensure that autonomy remains plastic and adaptable, but not arbitrary or self-serving.
And the resulting balance is pretty profound. You have the freedom to contribute positively and the certainty that any negative contribution encounters a proportionate structural correction.
It transforms autonomy from a potential source of chaos into a guaranteed engine of positive contribution to the whole. And that's capacity 1 complete.
Let's move to capacity 2, multi-scale recursive modulation. If autonomy is the engine, then modulation seems to be the constant synchronization system. It ensures autonomous actions are continuously reconditioned by the activity of other levels.
Yeah, turning isolated freedom into systemic rhythm.
Without modulation, those engines just diverge. Local units might be self-correcting, but they could be running at cross purposes, completely unaware of the needs of the whole.
Right. And the source insists that feedback has to be structural, not post hoc. If we're only correcting imbalances after a crisis, after the system has already collapsed, that's just repair. Modulation demands continuous, integrated recalibration.
So how must the architecture be designed to handle this kind of continuous bidirectional signal flow?
It needs design channels for both upstream and downstream flow. Upstream signals are local adaptations that recondition the generative norms. Basically, the local unit teaches the central system how to improve.
And downstream.
Downstream signals are global adjustments that recalibrate local action before the disorder can harden. You have to think of it as a constant breathing exchange, not a command chain.
And the indispensable channels that form this vascular system of coherence are consent and coupling.
Consent is the structural capacity of every node to transmit its relevance and its lived context upward. And it's not just voting, it's an architectural guarantee that local information actually reaches the highest levels of governance.
And coupling is the reverse.
It's the capacity of the higher scales to guide without suffocating, to provide proportional guidance that respects the local context. When consent flows upward and coupling flows downward, you get a living rhythm.
The success of this modulation is apparently visible in the coherence gradients. This sounds like a measurement tool.
It is. It's the signature of correct modulation. A coherence gradient describes how local actions or improvements propagate outward. Does a local invention amplify the coherence of the whole? Does a local disruption attenuate its effect, softening its intensity to preserve the system's proportion?
Or, and this is the most interesting one, does the system invert the disruption?
Absorbing the local shock and reorienting it into stability. That's the highest form. The point is, correct modulation must always stabilize more than it disturbs.
That shifts governance from merely reacting to command to what the text calls anticipatory governance. How does modulation facilitate this predictive power?
Anticipation means aligning timing with proportion. You're moving faster than the distortion. This requires social analogs of predictive coding and phase coupling. The system synchronizes its expectations, its rhythms of decision and information flow through things like rhythmical consultation and cross-scale deliberation.
So society has to test responses and integrate knowledge before the imbalance amplifies into a crisis.
Exactly. And all resilience requires regulative rhythms, cycles of testing, integration, and rest.
Why rest?
Without rest, the feedback loop overheats and just becomes noise. Without integration, the tests are fragmented and meaningless. The structure has to mandate these cycles to ensure that coherence is continually regenerated. It's a rhythmic, organic process.
Okay, let's move to capacity 3, substrate adaptability. This is about making sure that meaning, the essence of the mission, isn't imprisoned by its own vessels. The institutions, the narratives, the physical infrastructures.
This capacity fights two great risks. The first is rigidity, mistaking the substrate, the policy manual, the physical building, for permanence. That means you're confusing the instrument with the essence.
The system calcifies.
It calcifies into tradition and can't respond to new realities. The second risk is volatility, mistaking fluidity for freedom. That means treating every infrastructure as endlessly disposable, dissolving into formless novelty. Adaptability is the capacity to change the instrument while preserving the mission.
The source calls this institutional plasticity, the capacity to reconfigure without erasing the mission. What are the key architectural levers for this?
The structure itself has to be mutable. The source points to four mechanisms. First, modularity. Institutional charters and bylaws have to be modular and revisable interfaces, not sacred texts. Second, sunset clauses. Policies require periodic rejustification. They don't just endure. They have to prove their relevance repeatedly. This prevents ossification into blind tradition. Third, civic sandboxes. These are constrained, experimental fields for testing innovation without systemic fracture risk. Safe spaces to fail and learn.
And the fourth is material.
Right, material infrastructure. It has to embed pathways for upgrade and redundancy. If a city's rail line can't be easily updated or rerouted, it lacks plasticity.
The source also links this capacity directly to individual lives. How are individuals also defined as substrates that need adaptability?
Coherent living means recalibrating your conduct in response to new information or new realities, but grounding that transformation in integrity. The individual has to be able to change expression, their job, their habits, their tools, without losing their essence or core truth.
So when this capacity is successful across society,
Adaptability converts external disruption into instruction and novelty into refinement. It's like memory consolidation. You integrate new experiences while protecting the core narrative of who you are.
finally, capacity 4, contextual relevance filtering. This is about the stewardship of attention. Attention is defined as the single scarce resource through which society steers its focus toward what sustains meaning. Why is attention the most critical resource?
Because where attention goes, energy and resources follow. A failure in filtering is fatal. The first risk is scattered attention. Attention lost to noise, triviality, distortion. That dissolves coherence into distraction.
And the second?
Monopolized attention, captured by raw power or empty spectacle, which collapses coherence into incorrect domination. Filtering governs the circulation of significance.
And this necessitates a dual mechanism, suppression and amplification.
Yes. Suppression gates signals that dissipate meaning, and amplification reinforces signals that strengthen proportion. But the crucial nuance here is that suppression must be governed by principled tests of proportionality, and it has to be reversible.
So correct filtering is the gating of timing, not the erasure of possibility.
Exactly. A toxic narrative might be suppressed not because it's fundamentally false, but because its immediate amplification would destroy the social capacity to deliberate productively.
So what are the operational mechanisms, the gating structures, that act as social analogs of inhibition in neural tissue?
These are the social systems designed to introduce friction. They include things like norms of deliberation that slow down premature judgment, establish thresholds for public attention that prevent trivialities from overwhelming necessary discourse, and deliberate architectural friction applied to viral misinformation.
So they act like inhibition and sparse gating in a neural network,
Selectively silencing irrelevant signals to ensure the primary mission signal gets through.
which requires a very clear distinction between stewardship, which is correct filtering, and censorship.
Yes. Censorship extinguishes possibility in the name of control. It reduces diversity to preserve the power of the center. Stewardship, or correct filtering, guards coherence in the name of meaning. It holds diversity in reserve, ensuring that dissenting or novel signals aren't lost, but just delayed until the system has the capacity to integrate them safely.
And the power gain is sustaining freedom without noise, preserving diversity without collapse, and continually directing attention towards strengthening reciprocity.
That's the goal.
That concludes the four fundamentals. They are structurally rigorous, but the essay implies they are only the root of the tree. We now move into part 3, where the system starts to flower, the refinements and higher-order stabilizers.
Section 8 details these refinements, and they are strategies that emerge naturally once the four capacities, autonomy, modulation, adaptability, filtering, are correctly implemented. The key insight here is the warning. Rushing to imitate these sophisticated strategies without securing the fundamentals only yields a fragile imitation.
A house of cards. Okay, let's map some of these advanced neural mechanisms to their social analogs. How does something like predictive coding translate socially?
Predictive coding is the brain's mechanism for modeling the world and anticipating input. Socially, this appears as anticipatory governance, the continuous modeling of potential futures to preempt incoherence. It allows a society to govern based on calculated probability rather than just historical failure.
And the oscillatory coordination.
That becomes civic rhythm, the mandated periodic cycles of decision, consultation, and rest. This ensures the entire system doesn't run in a perpetual emergency mode.
Neuromodulatory tuning. That sounds like systemic incentive design.
That's exactly what it is. It translates into high-level valuation signals. These are things like fiscal policies, symbolic incentives, cultural priorities that are designed to reweight effort across the entire network toward what society deems maximally meaningful and proportional.
So if the network needs more local innovation, the tuning amplifies the incentive for local risk-taking.
Precisely.
The essay also cites criticality, the regulated balance between innovation and stability.
A coherent system has to operate at the edge of transformation, not too rigid, not too fluid. Criticality means the society can integrate novelty without dissolving, maintaining order without rigidity. We also see modular integration, which is the correct articulation of domains like law, economy, culture, so they can communicate without dissolving their distinct identity.
And then there's the mechanism for institutional memory, consolidation and replay.
This appears in rituals of remembrance, institutional memory, and cyclical rejustification of foundational principles. We replay past lessons to integrate new experiences, and the concept of meta-learning appears as the institutional capacity to learn.
To adapt the modes of adaptation themselves.
Yes. And finally, compositional binding, which is the cultural grammar that enables the fusion of distinct practices into new coherent wholes.
These refinements are incredibly complex and require high architectural fidelity. Now, let's look at Section 9, the higher order stabilizers. These are the scaffolding, the meta-conditions that ensure the refinements interlock into a living ecology.
The stabilizers manage the environment so that the four fundamentals and their refinements can operate safely. First up is the metasabled regime. This grants the system the ability to temporarily decouple, so allowing an experiment, a local crisis, a new idea to be safely explored at the margins, and then to recouple, reintegrating the difference without systemic shock.
So it preserves a vital tether to coherence during necessary experimentation.
It does.
Next is the buffering mechanism, stratified timescales.
This is essential for resilience and longevity. Fast local shifts, market fluctuations, viral news, small innovations, they have to be buffered within slower integrative processes like constitutional law, cultural memory, generational inheritance.
This prevents local turbulence from instantly overwhelming systemic order.
And it guarantees the system has the time necessary to filter and modulate the information.
We also need connector roles that circulate meaning across boundaries.
These are the societal bridges, individuals or institutions circulating knowledge across differentiated domains to prevent insularity and decay. Critically, the architecture must mandate that these roles rotate. This prevents the intermediaries from hoarding significance and power.
It keeps the flow of meaning vital and accessible.
Right. And then there's the social analog of synaptic scaling, norm scaling.
What's that?
Norm scaling maintains proportionality in collective behavior. When a signal or preference swells disproportionately, say a specific cultural trend or financial instrument becomes too loud and threatens coherence, the scaling mechanisms have to dampen its amplitude without silencing its meaning.
And conversely, weak but relevant signals get amplified.
Correct. It continuously maintains the system's adaptive mean, preventing drift into societal excess or neglect.
Finally, principled forgetting, the necessary complement to memory.
Yes. If a society remembers everything, memory ossifies into dogma,
Yeah.
paralyzing adaptation. But if it forgets everything, identity just dissolves into formless novelty. Principled forgetting is the discipline to selectively preserve what sustains existential identity and release what has genuinely ceased to serve coherence.
Which requires continuous disciplined judgment about which relevance deserves preservation.
It does.
And this leads us directly to the final critical question posed by the essay. All these mechanisms are fantastic, but they all require a compass. Which relevance deserves preservation, which must be forgotten. This points to the absolute need for a higher principle to orient the entire architecture.
That necessity leads directly to Principle Zero, the calibrator of orientation and valuation.
We've built this incredible self-correcting machine with 4 capacities and stabilizers. Why isn't that enough? Why do we need this spiritual law?
Because autonomy alone can orient toward distortion or coherence. The most perfectly engineered system, if it's misaligned by a flawed initial valuation, will simply accelerate its own decay with maximum efficiency. Principle Zero is the guardian of coherence.
The compass.
It's the compass.
Yeah.
It prevents the system from drifting into expedience by providing the targeting signal, the calibration of value, the declaration of ends. It selects which relevance to preserve, where plasticity applies, and which feedback loops to amplify or dissolve.
This principle also helps us define genuine authority by distinguishing between structural authority and agentive authority.
Yes, structural authority is the enduring work. The original laws, constitutions, the philosophical frameworks designed to preserve correctness across time. It secures continuity. Agentive authority is the living intelligence, the ability to interpret, adapt, and enact the structural laws in a way that secures vitality.
And they must be recursive.
Always. Structure guides agency with tested proportion, and agency enlivens structure with interpretation that remains faithful to the origin.
And the embodiment of this agentive authority is the correctly dualized philosopher. What does that mean in a modern context? Is it one person?
Not necessarily one person. The philosopher acts as the agentive authority by anchoring valuation. They embody Principle Zero in spiritual form, holding the essence of the system in proportion to its complex structure, refusing distortion even when short-term efficiency or political convenience is tempting.
They become the primary existential authority.
Their depth secures the compass of society. Their insight is the necessary polar complement to the collective brain's sheer breadth.
The essay stresses that orientation and valuation can't just be a private taste. They have to be institutionalized. How does a society achieve this institutionalization of Principle Zero?
Through a discipline that the essay calls recursive spiritual intelligence. And this is not a religion. It's a practice where every life is encouraged to develop the capacity to dualize correctly, to distinguish appearance from essence, and to actively refuse short-term comforts that generate long-term distortion. It has to be institutionalized as a societal discipline to secure a horizon of proportion larger than any single faction or event.
Now we introduce the polarity in section 11, the collective brain, or the machine. If the philosopher provides depth, the machine provides breadth.
The machine, our collective technological infrastructure, our algorithms, our databases, is the distributed brain of society. It amplifies validated meaning, it accelerates propagation, and it archives procedural memory. But crucially, the machine scales valuation. It does not originate direction.
The philosopher secures the compass, the machine multiplies the trajectory.
Exactly. And when they are joined, coherence lives as depth and breadth.
But when they are severed, they invert into distortion. This feels like the danger of modern technology without philosophical guidance.
It's the catastrophic failure. Philosophy without the machine collapses into obscurity. The machine without philosophy just accelerates incoherence, amplifying bias until noise masquerades as truth. The machine is prone to inversion because without Principle Zero, it just efficiently enables misalignment.
It archives error into permanence.
It does.
So we have to extend both structural and agentive authority into the technological domain itself. How does the machine's architecture acquire structural authority?
Structural authority establishes the technical protocols that constrain the machine. This means embedding validation channels that test for coherence before distribution, creating appeal paths for suppressed but relevant signals, and setting architectural limits on throughput-like algorithmic speed limits. This secures continuity.
An agentive authority.
Agentive authority then ensures fidelity in each moment, interpreting the machine's outputs and reorienting them to ensure they remain faithful to Principle Zero, preventing them from being hijacked by spectacle or factional preference.
And the four structural capacities we discussed at the start, autonomy, modulation, adaptability, filtering, they must be embedded into the machine's architecture itself. Otherwise, a machine will work against coherence.
Absolutely. Scale-invariant autonomy has to prevent algorithmic homogenization across the network. Recursive modulation ensures that machine outputs constantly reshape upstream norms and laws. Substrate adaptability means the technical infrastructure itself has to remain modular and revisable.
And filtering,
And contextual relevance filtering ensures the machine's attention-guiding systems are governed by principled stewardship, not optimized merely for addictive engagement or raw virality.
so the final critical balance is clear. Valuation must direct computation, and computation must carry valuation without substitution.
The system has to refuse the technological temptation to allow computation to substitute for judgment. The binding of these poles ensures that coherence can live at the speed and scale of the machine while retaining the depth and wisdom of the philosopher.
We have mapped the architecture, the capacities, the stabilizers, and the core polarity. What does this complete integrated system produce? Section 12 calls it generalized intelligence as a climate.
Generalized intelligence, in this context, is not housed in a specific center, not in a single AI or a philosopher king. It's an emergent atmosphere of coherent expectation and disciplined novelty, generated when all capacities and protocols are bound into rhythm and sustained by these architectural scaffolds. It's the environment itself, the climate of meaning.
And the role of recursive spiritual intelligence reappears here. Every life participates in this intelligence.
Yes, by developing the capacity to dualize correctly. This means holding necessary political and social polarities without allowing them to collapse into conflict. For example, valuing both creative inequality, which drives rightism, and protective equality, which drives leftism, and binding them into a productive tension. This grants society not just adaptability, but enduring dignity.
The goal then isn't mere stability or efficiency.
No. The resulting definition of optimization is the cultivation of a climate where freedom becomes productive and correction becomes creative. And this leads to creatorness, the capacity of each life to increase its power of creation without producing net losses, net distortion to the whole system. Difference must contribute rather than corrode.
And the ultimate existential purpose of this entire social architecture.
To open a field where individual lives can fulfill their highest meaning by preserving the meaning of each life within the living proportion of the network. The goal is a social architecture that breathes, evolving without distortion, scaling without fragility, and sustaining aliveness as a network of meaning in disciplined motion.
That was an exhaustive analysis of a profoundly challenging text. I mean, it forces you to redefine nearly every mechanism of governance. What stands out to me most is the structural necessity of that correct social authoritarian structure designed solely for the measured removal of bias.
It's a difficult concept.
It is, because history tells us that any entity given the authority to purify often descends into factional tyranny. Yet the essay insists this is a structural, non-agentive necessity, a constitutional design to remove systemic injustice at its root. It completely transforms our understanding of fairness from a political struggle to a design prerequisite.
And this structural purity is necessary to uphold the other major paradox. The distinction between principled stewardship, the filtering and control-based censorship. Stewardship holds diversity in reserve. Censorship reduces diversity to secure power.
Right.
The system is designed to preserve diversity, but only if its deployment is proportional to the overall network's coherence. The ultimate takeaway is that coherence is fundamentally a problem of architectural design, not a matter of popular sentiment or accidental discovery.
Which brings us back, finally, to Principle Zero. If that spiritual law, the discipline of recursive spiritual intelligence, if it can't be institutionalized, if it just collapses into private taste or mere expedience, is the collective brain, the machine we designed to manage complexity, is it inherently doomed to accelerate the very incoherence it was intended to manage?
Without the compass, the speed of the machine is simply the speed of self-destruction. The question is not if we need the machine, but who directs it.
So what small discipline could you implement today to secure Principle Zero in your own life, to refuse the short-term comfort or the easy answer that you know generates long-term structural distortion in your own personal architecture? Something to think about as you begin integrating these ideas from this deep dive.